Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year. My name is Mishka Ligot, and I'd like to welcome all of you watching from the warmth and comfort and safety of your respective homes to the first installment of a brand new season of Wisconsin Wednesdays. Tonight, we're featuring fiction writers Ladee Hubbard and Dantiel Moniz. They'll be reading from their latest books, The Rib King, out from Amistad, and Milk Blood Heat from Grove Press. Our next event will be on Wednesday, March 3rd, and will feature 4 writers, James Cruz, Jacube Danladi, Rachel Swearingen, and Angela Boras Hills. You can find a full list of this season's readings, including other Wisconsin Book Festival events, on the Crowdcast page, crowdcast.io/Wisconsin Book Festival. For those of you joining us for the first time this week, Wisconsin Wednesdays is an online reading series brought to you by the UW-Madison Program in Creative Writing and the Wisconsin Book Festival. As we reach nearly a year into the current health crisis, Wisconsin Wednesdays continues with the program and foundation's practice of hosting brilliant writers, many of them alumni or former fellows of the program who are currently promoting their new books. Along with rising to the challenge of social distancing measures and the inability to gather in person, we hope that Wisconsin Wednesdays, through its new virtual platform, is also able to carry out the Wisconsin idea, which declares that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. So we welcome you, whether you're joining us from Watertown, Waupun, Wausau, Wauwatosa, West Allis, Whitewater, Wisconsin Rapids, or anywhere else in the state, the Midwest, the US, or the world. And a special thank you is due to our partnering independent bookstores from all over Wisconsin. We'd like to thank our Room of One's Own in Madison, the bookstore in Appleton, the Village Booksmith in Baraboo, Honest Dog Books in Bayfield, Redberry Books in Cable, Inklink Books in East Troy, Daughters Books in Eau Claire, Woodland Pattern in Milwaukee, Fox Den Books in River Falls, Arcadia Books in Spring Green, Mind Chimes Bookshop in Three Lakes, and Driftless Books and Music in Viroqua. So please continue to support your local bookstores throughout this pandemic and consider placing an order for Ladee and Dantiel's books through any of these establishments tonight. Most offer shipping and contactless curbside pickup. You can find their contact information at our webpage, tinyurl.com/wiskweds. Before we proceed with the reading, we'd also like to recognize that Wisconsin Wednesdays is being broadcasted to you from Tijo, which is traditional Ho-Chunk land historically encroached and occupied through unjust legislations and treaties such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And we recognize the Ho-Chunk as the original and true stewards of this land and honor their continued resilience and resistance, along with that of the other 11 federally recognized First Nations that reside in the areas of this state. Ladee is joining us from New Orleans in Louisiana, which is traditional Chitimacha land, and Dantiel is broadcasting from Jacksonville, Florida, which is the ancestral land of the Timucua people. So finally, in the spirit of resilience and humanity's collective capacity for resourcefulness, we'd like to thank you viewers for your patience with our online format. So please bear with us should there be any technical issues that may arise during the reading. We'll have time for some Q&A with the authors after they read. So please use the box at the bottom of the Crowdcast page. I don't know if it's this side or this side, but you'll see it. To submit any questions you might have for Ladee and Dantiel at any time during the reading, and we'll do our best to accommodate your queries later during the event. I'd now like to introduce tonight's first reader, Ladee Hubbard. Ladee is the author of 2 novels, The Rib King and The Talented Ribkins, which received the 2018 Ernest J. Gaines Award for Literary Excellence. Her writing has appeared in Guernica, the Times Literary Supplement, Arkansas International, Copper Nickel, and Callaloo, among other venues. Ladee is the recipient of a 2016 Rona Jaff Foundations Award and has also received fellowships from Art OMI, the Sakhtar Foundation, the Sustainable Arts Foundation, Hedgebrook, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, among other places. Born in Massachusetts and raised in the US Virgin Islands and Florida, she currently lives in New Orleans with her husband and 3 children. So The Rib King, Hubbard's sophomore novel, has been described as upstairs, downstairs meets Parasite. The quasi-prequel to The Talented Ribkins is a riveting tale of Black labor and personhood as it struggles in the twin faces of whiteness and capitalism. In its chapters, an all-Black crew of house servants and groundspeople navigate their fraught and tricky relationship with the Barclays, their white Midwestern employers. Among these characters is August Sitwell, the Barclays' once loyal butler, who becomes the caricatured face of the meat sauce the Barclays resort to selling after their fortunes run out, and Jennie Williams, a domestic worker who strives to find financial backing for a product she's developed. After a decade-long gap, the narratives of the Barclays staff suddenly twist and tangle with each other in often surprising and violent ways that sharply critique and deconstruct narratives of Black minstrelsy and entrepreneurship. Quote, "The Rib King underscores the necessity of revisiting the violence that has been done to African Americans and the ways that language falls short of fully capturing its magnitude. Hubbard interweaves the macabre backstories that drive each of the Black characters up north, rendering the dark side of the Great Migration," end quote, writes Naomi Jackson for the Washington Post. Rigoberto Gonzalez for the LA Times says, "Hubbard's superpower is her gift for building extraordinary worlds that examine troubled periods of America's past while shedding light on the unquestionable innovation and determination of African Americans who, perhaps improbably, thrived within them." Kirkus Reviews calls the novel, quote, "an imaginative work, craftily depicting the failure of imagination that is American racism." So I can't wait for all of us to dive right into the world of this novel and hear more from this gripping and animated saga. Kicking off the first Wisconsin Wednesdays of 2021, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Ladee Hubbard reading from The Rib King. Ladee?
Hi. Oh, that was great. Okay. So I was just going to read from the first chapter of the book. It's called The Current Orphans. So here we go. Mr. Sitwell had just finished work and was passing through the garden on his way to Prescott Avenue when he happened to look up at the house and see something he shouldn't have. One of the Barclays' current orphans was standing in the main hall. Dressed in a gray shirt and dark blue knee pants, black stockings sagging above his brown shoes, the boy had his hands on his hips and head cocked to one side as he stared, transfixed by the antique starter pistol on the third shelf of Mrs. Barclay's cabinet d'objets. Mr. Sitwell frowned. The child had arrived from the asylum with two others 5 months before, and Miss Mamie, the cook who was in charge of their apprenticeship, told them the very first day that scullery boys were forbidden from loitering in the front of the house. Yet there the child was, just inside the window for all the world to see. Mr. Sitwell watched him reach into the cabinet and pull the pistol out. He peeked inside the chamber, then spun around and pointed it 3 times, left towards the velvet drapes, right towards the side table, and straight above him towards the chandelier. Then he smiled and mimicked the gesture of sliding the gun into an imaginary holster. When his game was finished, he put the pistol back and then turned and continued walking down the hall. But instead of heading toward the kitchen where he belonged, he was moving further away from it, towards the conservatory. Mr. Sitwell cocked his head and looked around the hall, trying to find the other two. The Barclays always brought orphans home in batches of 3, and, following the example of the industrial college, always between the ages of 14 and 15, making them old enough to work, but not so old that, in Mr. Barclay's view, the clay had so far hardened that it could not be reformed. For the past 20 years, they had been brought in at regular intervals to learn a trade under the supervision of the cook. Mostly they washed dishes, but by doing so, fulfilled Mrs. Barclay's sense of charitable obligation. The current orphans were extremely close, and Mr. Sitwell knew that if he saw one, the other two were sure to be nearby. They did everything together, and in fact, so favored one another that the first time he saw them standing in a row on the kitchen porch with their hands clasped behind their backs for Miss Mamie's inspection, he'd had a hard time telling them apart. He'd soon realized the easiest way to distinguish between them was to look for their scars. Frederick was the one with 3 nasty welts running in parallel lines down his left cheek, a memento of a frantic fork slashing from a South Side butcher with whom he'd had an unfortunate run-in when he was 7. Mac was the one who'd lost part of his right ear to a stockyard dog when he was 8. The one loitering in the hall now was Bart. Mr. Sitwell knew it as soon as he started walking. Bart had a peculiar way of moving, a staggered hop step caused by the fact that, due to circumstances he claimed he no longer remembered, he was missing the toes of his right foot. Bart hopped down the hall for a few moments and then stopped when he reached the door to the conservatory. Something, it seemed, was amiss with his trousers, and he reached down to make some adjustment to his buttons. When he was satisfied, he swung his arm behind him, grabbed a fistful of fabric from his rear, and lifted his right foot to shake out his pant leg. He set the foot down again and, after a couple more hops, disappeared through the conservatory door. Bart seemed awfully foolish. Mr. Sitwell's first thought was relief that he was not responsible for him, that all three boys were, technically, Miss Mamie's problem. But of course, Mr. Sitwell was the one who'd seen Bart, and having seen him, realized he had to make a choice. Either he would continue walking towards the streetcar stop as planned, or he would go back inside and drag Bart to the safety of the kitchen before any of the Barclays saw him too, in which case he would no doubt be sent packing. Then the door to Mr. Barclay's study opened, unleashing a wide swath of light just inside the window where Mr. Sitwell stood. He ducked down as a woman's voice called out, "Fine, Herbert, but remember, this is not the Monte Carlo. We have not been to the Monte Carlo in a very long time." Mrs. Barclay appeared in the window, skirts swishing and heels clicking as she moved down the hall towards the stairs in the upper chambers. Without thinking, Mr. Sitwell found himself jogging along the side of the house, headed towards the kitchen. It wasn't until he reached the back porch that it occurred to him why he was doing it. He liked these boys, cared about them, wanted them to do well. In the 20 years he'd worked for the Barclays, he'd seen dozens of orphans come and go, and always thought it a shame that Miss Mamie's predecessor, Mr. Boudreau, never did much to help them. He wasn't certain if it was something about these particular children or simply the fact that Miss Mamie handled her orphans so differently than Mr. Boudreau had handled his that had made such an impression on him. He'd noticed how careful they were not to tramp on his flowers when they walked through the garden, and he liked that they asked a lot of questions about herbs. He also liked that when they did ask questions, instead of scolding them for slacking the way Mr. Boudreau would have done, Miss Mamie seemed pleased they took an interest in something she considered useful. She was determined to actually teach them something and wanted them to leave the house knowing more than they had when they arrived. It was clear that she cared for them, and because of that, Mr. Sitwell found he couldn't help but care for them too. He stepped inside the house. Also, of course, there was the fact that he'd started out like them, waterfront orphan, beneficiary of the peculiar mingling of the Barclays' need for cheap labor and their relatively liberal views on children's reform. Mr. Sitwell was only 14 when he was plucked from the yard of the asylum. He'd started in the kitchen and, while other orphans came and went, had managed to stay on, gaining more and more of the Barclays' confidence through a combination of talent, wit, and fealty. He passed through the kitchen, through the pantry, pushed into the dark kitchen, then stopped when he saw Jennie, the new chambermaid, standing by the work window next to a large stack of napkins set out on the work table, all tucked into three-corner folds. She had her back to him and was looking out at the yard, a cigarette in her hand. When she heard him come in, she turned around and smiled. "Evening." Mr. Sitwell nodded. He could feel the muscles in his face tighten and was glad the room was dark. He'd been practicing talking to Jennie in the mirror at the rooming house where he lived. He knew he had an unfortunate habit of frowning at pretty women, and also that he looked ugly when he did. "You're here late. Had to finish these." She nodded to the stack. Mr. Sitwell struggled to fit his face into a smile as calm and cool as hers. "Miss Mamie making you stay to do all that?" "Honestly, she told me to do it this morning." "I forgot," Jennie said, one arm wrapped around the front of her waist, the other holding the cigarette. "Don't tell her." Mr. Sitwell arched his eyebrows in an effort to keep his brow from furrowing over. "How you getting home, Jennie?" "What on earth do you mean?" "I just mean it's late." "Is it?" She glanced at the clock on the counter near the stove. "9? Well, I guess it depends who you ask." She was still smiling. Mr. Sitwell had noticed that about her. She smiled a lot, had a way of talking to people as if what she really wanted to do was laugh at them. When she first started working there 2 months before, it had hurt his feelings a couple of times before he realized she talked to everybody like that, even Miss Mamie, that it was just her way. I could walk you to the streetcar if you'd like. Make sure you get there safe. He looked away from her towards the sink and was disappointed when he saw the stack of dirty pots still piled there. Well, aren't you sweet? Jennie said. That's real nice, Sitwell. Honestly, I can't imagine a girl needs much protection in this neighborhood, never mind the hour, but I certainly would appreciate the company. Mr. Sitwell nodded and looked back at the pots. If the Barclays didn't send those boys back to the asylum for wandering the halls at night, Miss Mamie just might, if they were stupid enough to leave a mess like that. Could you wait a few minutes? I've just got to take care of something real quick. All right, Sitwell. I don't mind waiting. Give me a chance to put these napkins away. She flicked her cigarette out the window. Mr. Sitwell reached down to straighten his tie, then pushed through the swinging door that led to the front of the house. As he passed through the dining room, his heart was beating fast, but he had to figure that hadn't gone so bad. He'd been trying to think of questions to ask Jennie since she started working there, but that was the first time they'd been alone. Jennie, he decided, was a nice person, and looking back on their conversation, not scary at all. A lot of people on staff didn't know what to make of her, in part because of the smiling, but also because they were still adjusting to the fact that Petunia, the woman she'd replaced, was indeed gone. Petunia's termination had been a shock, not because she'd been good at her job, but because she'd been there doing her job badly for so long. When Mamie got promoted and took charge of the kitchen, it seemed like the first thing she did was send Petunia home. He walked up a short flight of stairs and entered the main hall, the chandelier above him shining a harsh light on the objects in Mrs. Barclay's cabinet. He looked at the pistol that had so entranced Bart and noticed at once that the gilt was peeling on the handle. Several other items on the shelves were chipped or otherwise damaged. Electric lighting, which had seemed necessary only because everyone on the block else on the block now had it, had not been kind to that house. There was a reason for the care Mrs. Lawson, the parlor maid, took to ensure that each lamp was covered with a cloth of a particular weight when company came to dinner. Some of the rugs in the hall were worn down and frayed from overuse. There were water stains on the side tables in the parlor, and the velvet cushions of the couch in the conservatory were bleached in places. All of these flaws had been there for years, but were made disturbingly visible by the new glare. He continued down the hall. He still remembered when he was a boy, like the three he was looking for now, how fine that house had seemed to him, the glitz and glitter of the various curios in Mrs. Barclay's cabinet sparking in the warm glow of the gas lights. There'd been a time when he was convinced this was not simply the finest house he'd ever seen, but perhaps the finest there ever was. Then, one day when he was 15, he was standing in the front yard and happened to look beyond the Barclays fence. For the first time, it occurred to him that most of the houses on the avenue were twice the size of the one where he worked, that the Barclays had neighbors who, if they wanted to, could have bought and sold both his employers and everything they owned several times over. He must have looked over that fence 1,000 times before this actually occurred to him. Before that, the house had always been just another part of the block, an extension of the world it belonged to, and therefore extremely precious. He moved past the stairs. Perhaps the Barclays weren't as rich and important as they once were, but this was still a good house. The boys had a good thing there, whether they realized it or not. What been given wasn't exactly charity, but it was better than the industrial college, where scores of boys and girls shivered on cold factory room floors 14 hours a day. Here they worked hard, but they slept on warm cots at night, and Miss Mamie made sure they were always well fed. The Barclays were not crazy enough to be unmanageable, and miraculously for the times, still maintained an entirely colored staff. The Barclays had come to the city from Missouri 35 before with their cook, Mr. Boudreaux. They did not believe in race mixing in the kitchen, rightly thought it caused too many problems. Because Mr. Boudreau had been colored, the rest of the staff, out of necessity, had to be colored too. When he finally left, Miss Mamie, his former assistant, had been the obvious choice to take his place. This meant that so long as she continued to cook and maintain order to the Barclays' satisfaction, the opportunity to be reformed in the kitchen would remain the exclusive preserve of three colored orphans between the age of 14 and 15. When he reached the conservatory, he heard a loud "ooh," followed by a series of childish giggles. He pushed the door open and found the three boys huddled together on the floor near the piano, with Frederick at the center. From the halting sound of Frederick's voice, Mr. Sitwell could tell he was reading. Now that Cherokee knew that Wash Talbot, his former deputy, had been arrested, he had to make a choice: keep his vow to never again set foot in Seminole County, or let the last remaining member of his gang fall into the hands of an angry mob. "What are you boys doing?" They spun around in unison and blinked at him with enormous brown eyes. They were handsome children with bright round faces, thick eyebrows, full lips, and skin the dark red color of cedar wood. Their features were so similar that anybody would have mistaken them for actual brothers. In truth, they were not blood relatives at all. Their strong bond was formed in the interest of survival on the waterfront. "Nothing, sir," Max smiled, eyes all innocent. "Just sitting here reading." "In the front of the house?" "Oh, nobody saw us. We made sure them folks was long gone before we came here," Frederick said. He lifted his arms and rocked back and forth in imitation of someone else's waltz. "We waited till they finished dancing." Mr. Sitwell frowned. "Somebody saw you. I did. Saw Bart playing in the hall when I was on my way out. Then come to find you haven't even finished cleaning the kitchen." "Not true, sir. Kitchen's all done," Bart said. "Well, except for the pots. Remember last time how Miss Mamie told us not to disturb Mr. Barclay's guests with a lot of banging while folks were eating dinner? Figured this time we'd just wait until the dinner was over so as not to bother nobody." The boy looked very proud of himself. "It's all right, sir. We don't mind working late." "The last guest left over an hour ago," Mr. Sitwell said. "Really? Dang. It didn't feel like we'd been in here but 5 minutes." The boys stared at one another as if there was something wondrous about their shared trance. "You mean to say we've been sitting here reading all that time?" Mr. Sitwell held out his hand. "Give it to me." Frederick gave him the book. On the cover was a picture of a tall, thin white man with green eyes and a long red beard, clutching a pistol in each hand. "What is this?" "The Life and Times of Cherokee Red, Wild Man of the Reconstruction," Frederick said. "You ever read it?" "No." "But you heard about him, right? Started out during the war, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Now his gang's all busted up. He and his lady love moved out west to put the past behind them, and he's been trying his hand at being a farmer. But just when it seems like his gunslinging days are over, he finds out Wash Talbot, the last surviving member of his gang, was caught stealing hogs and got himself locked up back in Florida." "What?" "He stole a hog." "Who did?" "Wash Talbot." Mr. Sitwell squinted at the cover. He'd never heard of Cherokee Red, but he knew the name Wash Talbot from when he was a boy back in Florida, just like in the book. He handed it to Frederick. "Where does it say that name? Show me. Wash Talbot." Frederick opened the book and started flipping pages. After a while, he set his finger down and read, "Another infamous member of the gang was Wash Talbot, who never would renounce his lawless ways. For years after the gang disbanded, he was still hiding out in the swamps of Seminole County, a terror to the neighboring towns." "That's enough," Mr. Sitwell said. "Pernicious lies." "Sir, I knew that man." "Who? Cherokee Red?" "Wash Talbot. He was a simple farmer." The boys looked disappointed. "Probably not the same man then," Max said. "Was your Wash from Seminole too?" Mr. Sitwell shook his head. I don't recall." He was lying. compelled by a childhood admonishment to say nothing about where he came from, even though he realized there was no cause for it any longer. It was the same reason he'd refused to give his real name when, lured by the promise of food, he'd voluntarily entered the doors of the asylum 20 years before. And then again, a few months after that, when he found himself standing on the Barclays back porch, hands clasped behind his back and wedged between those other two boys. Where did you get this? One of Mr. Barclay's guests gave it to us after Tuesday's party. Mr. Sitwell frowned. It's true, sir. We didn't steal it, Mr. Sitwell. I'm going to have to ask Mr. Barclay about that. That's fine, but can we finish it first? We were just getting to the best part. What part is that? It's the beginning of the end. Mr. Sitwell sighed. Despite the lives they'd led and the work they did, they were still such children. Yet he knew if they did not learn certain lessons, they wouldn't last long in the Barclay house, to say nothing of the world outside it. You boys are going to have to learn to be more careful. You got to remember where you are. You got to remember who. You shouldn't be in the front of the house. You shouldn't be talking to Mr. Barclay's guests, much less, as you say, accepting gifts from them. I didn't lie, Frederick pouted. I told you he said we can have it. That's not the point. What if you misunderstood the man's meaning? Or what if the man simply changed his mind? Don't you realize that an accusation of theft can be just as bad as a theft itself? Sometimes it's even worse. No, sir. I suppose we didn't think about those things, Frederick nodded. I understand. Mr. Sitwell frowned. He could tell from the boy's expression that Frederick thought he understood, but also that, in truth, he did not. Best get back in there and finish that kitchen before Miss Mamie sees it. Yes, sir. They scrambled to their feet and sprinted down the hall. Mr. Sitwell stood for a moment with the book in his hands, trying to decide what to do with it. He looked at the cover. Mr. Sitwell was only 9 when he left Florida, and there were many things about those early days he no longer recalled. The name Wash Talbot, however, was not one of them. The man had been a neighbor friend of his mother's and, as he told the boys, came from a family of subsistence farmers, much like his own had been. It certainly seemed more than mere coincidence that, as was true of the outlaw in the book, the Wash he remembered had come to his end over conflicting claims with a man from the neighboring town over livestock. Except, and this too, Mr. Sitwell remembered with perfect clarity, the Wash he'd known hadn't been jailed over a hog. It was a mule, and he hadn't stolen it. He'd shot it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lady. That was fantastic, and like, what a great opening to a novel. Thank you.
Thank you.
So tonight's second reader is Dantiel W. Moniz. Dantiel is the recipient of the Alice Hoffman Prize for Fiction, the Cecilia Joyce Johnson Emerging Writer Award by the Key West Literary Seminar, and the Tin House Scholarship. Her fiction has appeared in the Paris Review, Tin House, One Story, Plowshares, the Yale Review, McSweeney's, and elsewhere. Milk Blood Heat is her first book. She lives in Northeast Florida and currently teaches fiction at UW-Madison. Milk Blood Heat is a testament to flesh, Black bodies, female bodies, bodies under labor and duress, bodies caught in the crossfire of rapture and pleasure. In 11 punchy and electrifying stories set against the sticky cities and suburbs of Florida, Moniz crafts narratives that sing not only of what we carry in our bodies, but also the vessels that house these histories and tensions themselves. Two siblings take a cross-country trip carrying the ashes of their complicated father. A bartender wastes desire and bitterness during a rare bout of Floridian snowfall. Nameless workers at a devious supper club carry on with their lives despite the dark machinery of their livelihood. Women and girls deal with griefs larger than their hearts can carry. And through it all, Moniz's voice remains immensely sharp and illuminating. And these stories are a hit. The collection has been a frequent title in so many most anticipated book lists: Time, Elle, BuzzFeed, Essence, Entertainment Weekly, Electric Literature, the list goes on. Lauren Groff, author of Florida, praises how Moniz, quote, sings of Florida, girlhood, family, loss, and the glorious, ecstatic, devastating human body, end quote. Quote, these stories and the characters that drive in them are like lightning, end quote, writes Daniel Evans, author of the Office of Historical Corrections. Quote, Moniz's writing is lush and sharp, her landscape so rich it feels like we could step into it, her characters so alive and full of longing that they might just step off the page and take the reader with them wherever they're headed next, end quote. Dantiel is, to put it simply, a superstar. I was immensely lucky to be in the junior class. Her senior cohort welcomed to the program at UW. And Dantiel's always just been that one street smart and immensely cool big sister who you just knew was going to blow up someday. And she certainly has. I'm thrilled she's joining us tonight, reading from Milk Blood Heat. Please welcome Dantiel W. Moniz.
Mishka, very cute. Hi, I'm really happy to be here, to be back in Madison. Quick aside, my earring fell off like right as Mishka started to introduce me, and I had to like make an earring back out of an eraser. Thank God I had that on my desk, but I just wanted you to know what was going on. I'm gonna read just from the beginning of a story called The Loss of Heaven. He weighed 210 pounds, buck ass naked, 217 in his leather jacket and boots, which he wore that crisp March evening to the bar along with a gold stud pin in his lapel. It was shaped like a spade, a gift from his wife when they were young, once she discovered how much he liked expensive-looking things. He wasn't handsome, but his light skin, wavy hair, the polished gleam of his fingernails, and the bills pressed tightly in his wallet almost made him so. As he entered the Albatross, he stopped just in the doorway, imagining his body filling the width of the frame, giving the occupants time to look and wonder who he was. The jukebox played The Temptations and threw colored light onto his face, and a couple of women at a nearby table glanced up from their pastel martinis, one sucking the cherry from her drink. Satisfied, he walked in. Hilda swept a dish towel along the bar top, looking bored, smiling out from under her bangs at a trio of men at the counter, a pretty laugh spilling from deep within her chest. He chose a stool in the middle, with an unobstructed view of her. Hey there, Fred. Gin and Coke? She asked, the start to their ritual. Her low, drawling voice pulled something tight inside his stomach. You know it, kid, he said. He slid his jacket off and draped it on the back of his chair as she filled a rocks glass with 3 large cubes of ice, so big they could sit in a drink a while before melting. In the few months since he'd met her, Fred often imagined tracing one down the contours of Hilda's spine, recording an exact ratio of body heat and melting points. No lime, Hilda sang, placing his drink in front of him, on a square of white napkin she'd sprinkled with salt. Start a tab? I'll pay as I go, Fred told her, as he always did, and placed a 5 on the bar. Hilda disappeared the bill into her apron and one discreet fluid motion. She never brought him change. The Albatross hosted a quiet crowd on Tuesday evenings, a mix of suits, day laborers, and truckers with 3-day scruff. The bar's aesthetic lingered somewhere between a dive and a lounge, sporting wood details and burgundy upholstery along with burger specials and streetwise games of pool on red felt in the back. Older gentlemen sat at tables in dim corners sipping rye whiskey, talking with other men about matters only other men would understand. Some kept their hands high on the thighs of women who were not their wives, girls really, who did not yet keep house and so still had inexact ideas about how the world worked and all of the ways in which they could be disappointed. The girls possessed a malleability, a willingness to be impressed, their cheeks soft and new, flushing at even the most trivial compliments. These were sweet, bygone qualities men wished to bottle and harbor for themselves. Fred took a swig from his drink and watched the young bartender over the rim of his glass. He liked the healthy way her hips moved under her black uniform skirt, the deep brown of her skin, the way she talked to other men, her oiled hair sweeping forward as she leaned over the bar to take their orders, a grin under every word. He liked that she knew what a $2 a drink tip was worth and that his glass was never empty. Hilda smiled every time she made him a new one, as if they shared a secret, as if she knew him. And sometimes her fingers would linger over his, creating heft and heat. Still good, Fred? She'd ask from time to time, letting him watch her, making sure he never lost sight of his importance. He was good. Fred lifted his glass to her, the bite of bourbon still glowing in his throat. To beautiful friendships, he said. And when Hilda laughed, even that seemed just for him. Fred spent $30 at the bar before heading home. He kept the radio off, preferring just the sound of his tires crunching gravel on the road, the shake of the V6 under his seat. He'd bought the '85 Buick Regal brand new, metallic blue with a racing stripe, as a present to himself after he'd turned 52. When he'd driven it into the yard 6 years ago, his wife had laughed to see it, asking if this was the Band-Aid for his midlife event. What's next, she hawed, a mistress? Fred had been offended. He wasn't old, not yet, and he deserved nice things. Now he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. You're still the man, Fred told himself, and watched his eyes to see if he believed it. Gloria was on the porch in her nightgown when he pulled up, a cigarette dangling between her elegant fingers. Fred cut the engine and sat for a moment, flexing his fists around the steering wheel, trying to calm himself. It wouldn't do to start a fight. He got out of the car and hauled himself up the porch steps, leaning against the railing next to her. He studied her profile, the tufts of newly grown out hair like shredded brown cotton, the petite ears and dished forehead, her angled jaw, the small triangle of skin beginning to loosen beneath her chin. The sheer nightgown slipped from one burnished shoulder and piled on the floorboards around her crossed ankles. It swallowed her. She looked like a child dressed in her mother's clothes, and in that moment, he loved her terribly. The porch light glowed orange and flickered with dazed moths as Gloria let him watch her. She brought the cigarette to her mouth and took a long, smooth drag. Fred imagined the smoke swirling down into the cage of her chest, every bone illuminated, turning what was left of her lungs the color of stone. She finally turned to face him, her eyes wet and penetrating in their dark hollows, and he remembered when he used to call her his little bit of glory. He didn't know when he'd stopped. How is today? He asked. Fine as can be expected, Gloria said, flicking ash. And the doctor? What did he say? Fred. She dropped his name like an anchor. It's fine. He started to speak, then changed his mind. He wanted to shake her, grip hard into those bird-boned shoulders until he felt them snap. But only a monster would treat a dying person like that. Instead, he held out his hand. Let's go inside. She smiled at him, but didn't move. I'm sitting with the night, she said, and looked over the yard toward the low edge of the horizon, still crimson from the parting sun. Fred's shoulders sagged under the weight of sudden gravities, that she preferred her cigarettes and her own company to him, that she'd even started smoking the damn things again in the first place, and now wasn't troubling to hide it. When 2 months ago her oncologist had hustled them into his office with his grim face and rattled off his list of bloated, ugly words, recurrence, metastasis, inoperable, Gloria had taken it dry-eyed, her head bobbing as if she too were a doctor, comfortable with the impersonal language of death. He recommended immediate and aggressive treatment, and Fred had coughed into his hand. What are our chances here? He'd asked, and ignored how Gloria's head whipped when he said it. We're not worried about the cost. He wouldn't let this white man or anyone else think they were poor. The doctor cleared his throat, said, studies suggest that patients in this stage, with targeted therapies prescribed in conjunction with homeopathic remedies and rigorous adherence to the plan, and Gloria stood up and left. Fred found her 10 minutes later posted up at the car with her purse on the hood, pretending to pick dirt from her fingernails. As he unlocked the door, he'd given her a questioning look and she'd just shaken her head. Fred reflected that only she could look annoyed after hearing a scary verdict like that. Only she could be so rankled. The first time they'd gotten this news last winter, she'd climbed back into the car and bawled the entire drive home, and he'd had to carry her into the house. Fred waited for this delayed reaction, but she didn't cry. Gloria said, looking out the window at the street going past, none of that had anything to do with me. All that was two men talking in a room. The reaction did come later that night as they ate dinner, smothered pork chops and mashed potatoes and peas, but not the one he had expected. I'm not doing the chemo. I'm done. Baby, you're in shock, he told her, because he certainly was. It had been hard on her, the chemo, the radiation, each feeling like additional sickness than any kind of treatment. They'd cut Gloria open and removed a lobe of lung, and now a long, pillowy scar curved under her right breast, raised several centimeters from the surrounding skin. She said it was her last-minute souvenir, like, ha ha, what'd you bring me back from Cancerland? Forgetting the scar, the loss of her hair, the sores in her mouth, and the dizzy nausea and fear of it all, they'd beaten the cancer back. And just as they were celebrating, finally crawling towards something like normal, this. It felt like the worst betrayal. But Fred knew if they did it once, they could do it again. He repeated that financially they were good, just in case she felt guilty over how much killing the cancer cost. Fred was a provider, always had been, always would be, a retired car hauler who had worked since the age of 13. Above all else, he was a man, and he took care of his own. No one could say any different. Gloria set down her cutlery and rubbed the place between her eyes, and when she spoke again, she looked tired and patient, like some kind of martyr. He remembered feeling irked by it. Fred, You're not hearing me. I said I'm done. If it's my time, it's my time. He hadn't believed her then, but shortly after that night, he began to smell smoke on Gloria's clothes. At first, she spun the usual line. It was others smoking near her, but then he'd found a half-full pack on the floorboard of her back seat. She'd been in the living room reading when he confronted her, glasses sliding down her nose. He flung the pack at her, and it hit her in the chest. I guess you've made up your mind, he growled. To live the way I want to live? You mean die the way you want to die? And she'd said, what's the difference? She was punishing him, he knew, and Fred's stomach seized at the thought of all the things Gloria didn't say, that she kept at bay with such inconsequentialities as fine and answered to his nearly every question. Fred was certain that she somehow saw everything about him, that this cancer, as it ate at her body, had imparted in her a kind of godly knowing in exchange for what it took. When Gloria looked at him, Fred could feel his wrongdoings bathed in light, his dalliances with other women, that he had denied Gloria children because he hadn't wanted to be encumbered by their need. She knew too about the mad money tucked away in a secret compartment in his wallet, about the disgust he'd felt upon first finding out about the tumor, at the weakness of her body, his resentment at swapping roles when she was 9 years younger and supposed to take care of him, and the worst possibility, that Gloria could taste his absolute terror at being left alone, the bitter tinge of his shame dissolving on her tongue. She knew he would be a coward without her, and he believed a part of her enjoyed the thought. Fred went inside alone, trailing through the 3-bedroom split model house that they owned outright and which she often said was too large for just the two of them. She thought he'd bought it because he'd wanted a family, but he liked the acre of land it sat on and the idea that he could own it. Over the years, he'd let Gloria fill the rooms with art and plants and rare books since she couldn't fill them with children. In their bedroom, he removed his boots and leather jacket. He left his Oxford and undershirt on a growing pile of clothes Gloria had yet to wash, then stepped out of his pants and double-checked that the 10 crisp bills in the hidden pocket of his wallet, all hundreds, were still there. He took the bills out and ran his fingers along the creased edges, measured their weight on his palm. When he was younger, and his older sisters in dating range, he'd listen to their mother caution her daughters anytime they went out with a new boy, giving them money to hide in their socks. He'd never seen either of his parents so free with cash, but when it was his turn to court, his father merely said, "Don't get them pregnant." Fred never got the lecture or the mad money and felt left out. What if he needed to escape? Holding the money gave Fred a sort of chill, a pulse of irrational pleasure at the thought of getting into his Buick and driving away. Maybe he'd leave the swampy stench of Florida and go back home to the Tennessee foothills to live in the house his father had built. Maybe Hilda would be with him, riding shotgun, her luxurious heavy hair whipping in the breeze. He pictured her red lips smile, her hand on his arm, and wasn't that the most coveted thing, a pretty woman content to be near you? Standing in only his underwear and socks, he put the bills away and searched through Gloria's side table as he did whenever his own fantasies made him paranoid. He found nothing. No secret money, no getaway plan, just an unopened pack of Virginia Slims, her little sticks of spite. He would have liked to trash them, but it wouldn't matter. There was always another pack. Fred closed the drawer, then walked to the bathroom to remove the rest of his clothes. Naked, he stood upon his scale and closed his eyes. When he opened them, he found he still weighed the same, even with all of his transgressions nestled snugly inside him. Thank you.
I'm still on mute. There we go.
Mute.
Thank you so much, Dantiel. You think that a year into Zooming, we get used to it. It was fantastic. I'd like to call Ladee back. And it's time for some Q&A. If you viewers back home have any questions for either or both of the authors, please use the question tool at the bottom of the Crowdcast page to submit your query, and we'll try to get to them to the best of our ability. But wow, I love that we're starting out the year with this reading series, with this event. This question is for the both of you. I think one undeniable thread connecting your bodies of work is Florida, and specifically a Black ontology of Florida, right? Milk, Blood, Heat is like, it's unabashedly Floridian, and so is the Talented Ribkins. The eponymous Ribkins' roots lie in the Sunshine State, and the Midwestern backdrop of the novel kind of like highlight this disjunct. So how did this complex, conflicting, and often misunderstood like space speak so much to your respective work?
Oh,
You start, Ladee.
Yeah, well, one thing about that is Florida is such a huge state, and I feel like there's so many different Floridas. Like, Northern Florida is very different in a lot of ways from the Florida that I spent a lot of my childhood in, which is like St. Petersburg, Florida. Um, Yeah, so that specific community definitely had a big impact. It shows up in my work a lot because it means a lot to me. My grandparents were there, and I spent literally since I was a year old, every single summer there in St. Petersburg. And I actually was thinking that specific community, it was the south side of St. Petersburg. And this is like it's very interesting because my mother moved so much. Like, I lived in a lot of different places with my mother, and then I would come back to this like sort of very specific Florida every summer and spend, 3 months of my life every year there. And I was thinking about that my Florida was extremely segregated, for one thing. So I, growing up in the summers, did not really interact with anyone that was not Black or brown in the summers. And it was it was such a routine thing that I never really thought about that until I was much older. So that is a very specific, I mean, there are lots of other things I could say about Florida, but that is a very specific Florida. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of weird because it's so regionally diverse, and you can have so many different experiences of place in that one state. Yeah.
I'm glad you bring up the diversity of the state, because I think, just from memes and like the news, people think of this one, they either think of like, oh, they're thinking about Miami or like South
Right.
Florida, or they're thinking like Disney World or like backwoods or whatever people are thinking. But like, it's so giant and it's so diverse, and it's people and it's geography. We have swamps, we've got cities, we've got, fields, farmland, all that stuff. And I think that for me, I'm from here, and I never really see Jacksonville written about. Even when it is Florida, it's like I said, it's those other places. And so I really wanted to just kind of honor that, and not in a way that would add to the stereotype of what Florida is. I think a lot of that, like, oh, Florida, let's cut it off and send it into the sea. I think a lot of that has to do with elitism, honestly. And a lot of Southern states experience that.
That's true. That's really true. It's also it's as a Southern state, like New Orleans as a Southern city is so sort of old timey, like plantations. And I don't, at least where I am, I didn't really see that. I mean, it's very Southern, but it's, I don't know if that's part of why it has a reputation for being so odd, because it's sort of its relationship to the South. It seems so sort of, I don't know, distinct.
I mean, yeah, I mean, like it's true that too, when you think about the further south you go in Florida, the less Southern it gets.
Isn't that something?
So you think about South Florida, but we definitely took a field trip to the Kingsley Plantation in Jacksonville, which in high school, I'm just like, oh, I'm walking around slave corners. And yeah.
So, and it might have been there. I just didn't, again, I stayed really in a very small
I went to college in St. Pete. So I know, I'm familiar with that too. I went, I did my undergraduate there. At Eckerd College.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, that's actually very near to where my grandparents live. So.
Okay, cool.
But no, I find Florida really fascinating. It's a really fascinating state, but it is true. I think there is a lot of elitism to how it's portrayed, and I think it's really a very complicated and rich culture in a lot of ways that haven't really fully been considered maybe before. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. And now, so in the spirit of bringing you both virtually back to Madison and to completely pull you 1,000 miles north with this next question, I'd love to hear about your experiences here in UW with the program, the university, the city. Both of you are MFA alumni, and Dantiel, you're set to return, well, virtually for now, as the Mendota Lecturer in Fiction. And so as writers, were there ideas or practices, viewpoints, projects that were either born, transformed, refined, or even like thrown away during your time in Wisconsin, which I'm sure is a universe different from Florida?
Yeah.
Well, I can say that both I was working on both the Talented Ribkins and the Rib King while I was in at UW. And that's actually because that's where the origins of the character of the Rib King is. That's really the only real connection between the two books because they're totally different books. But I was working on them, and as was pointed out to me earlier, when I came there, I had 3 children. I came up with an infant.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had an infant and 2 other children when I went up there, and I felt everything felt very precarious for me. Do you know what I mean? Like I was really worried that no one would take me seriously because I had all these babies and stuff, you know? And I'm really glad that I'd never been to Wisconsin before. I'm so glad that I wound up at that program that was so supportive. And so for me, I feel like that's because it literally is true, like where I sort of learned to take myself seriously as a writer and to sort of envision that as something that was accomplishable for me. And I certainly, because it's very funny to me to reflect on that because I really felt crazy a lot of times up there. There were all these kids everywhere. I was like, no one is going to take you seriously. But and it's such a small program. It was very nurturing for me, and it was a really wonderful experience for me. And I'm very I feel very fortunate that is where I went to get an MFA. Yeah.
Same. I feel the same. It was also my first time in Wisconsin. I didn't really have a visual picture like, oh, Madison, Wisconsin. I'm like, I don't know what that means. You know what I mean? I had no reference point for it other than like, okay, what, milk and meat? You know what I mean? Like just in general, but like, yeah, Madison was really cute.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I felt that was for me the first time that, again, like you said, like that was the first time that I was like, all right, I'm taking my writing seriously. I don't know what the atmosphere is going to be, but it ended up being very supportive. I'm really glad to be back there to return some of that care that I experienced at Madison to my own students. But I was working on Milk, Blood, Heat there and a novel. So I was workshopping the stories that would be in Milk, Blood, Heat, and I was doing the novel as my thesis with Judy because I had no intention of workshopping it. But it's funny. So what Ladee was saying about like the kids coming and why we were laughing is because one of my conferences with Judy, I was saying my whole first semester, I couldn't write. I think it was just the anxiety of like, oh my God, I'm not supposed to be here. I feel like I made a mistake, or like, what if they find out that I'm not supposed to be here, basically. And I was talking about it with Judy and I was like, I just don't know if I can do it, and she kind of was like, well, Ladee Hubbard came and she had infant and these children and she got it done. So, and I was like, oh, okay. And so then I got it done. So that's the joke. That's the funny thing.
Well, I'm glad you did. So yeah, that's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. It is a very odd but very caring place. It's the only place in the US I've lived in, other than the tropics. So it's really just like, oh, ice and friends.
Ice and friends.
Yeah. So Ladee, The Rib King is your second book, and Dantiel, Milk, Blood, Heat is your debut. Dantiel, I'd love if you could speak more about the experience of putting your first book out in the world. Despite the pandemic, I feel like it's been a pretty fantastic run. And then, Ladee, I'm interested in how the journey of writing's been so far with a book too. Like this putting out a second book feel different from the debut? Do you see yourself like adding to the universe of these two books, or is this like a point of departure for you? So, my question's more about like in terms of like what I hope to be long, lucrative careers. How did it feel like putting out a first bok for you, Dantiel, and Ladee, a second book?
So, obviously all of this is brand new to me. Like all of what I know about this industry came from my time in the MFA and afterwards. So it's like been a really steep learning curve. But I feel like, obviously I feel a little bit sad that I didn't get to do like the whole get on a plane every night and go, meet people, because I enjoy doing that. However, I think that I'm fortunate when my book is debuting now because they had all of 2020 to kind of fine tune what the virtual tour looks like. And now it's pretty much old hat. You know what I mean? It's been all worked out. So I mean, I feel like too, maybe one of the pros is that I'm getting to meet a lot more people than I probably would have if it wasn't virtual, especially if you're talking about a debut with short stories, which we know how the industry treats short stories. It's like the, you know, like the little orphan art form over here. So I'm having a good time. It seems like people are reading the book, and it's a little overwhelming. Nobody can prepare you for people reading your book. Like, you know, you ask for that. You ask like, please read my book. And then people start reading it and you're like, oh my God, there's this weird thing that happens with the visibility that's a little bit, takes some time to acclimate to, but I'm enjoying it so far. Yeah.
The second book, I don't know. That's it.
Oh no, I was hoping you had secrets.
No, I don't have secret. It's my second book. So it's a totally new experience for me as well. Yeah, it is very different. You know, being in quarantine. I think it was for me, it was more of a strange experience to have all this going on while I was trying to get it together. That was a little bit strange for me. But no, I'm you know, I'm just happy that it's out. And yeah, I don't know. I'm glad. I always worry that people will not understand what I'm trying to do with these books, because it's very personal and I tend to have like a lot going on. So it's been I'm always gratified if people can understand why I wrote what I wrote and seem to appreciate it. That means a lot to me. So yeah, it's nice. I don't know if that answered any question whatsoever that you asked me. I know, obviously, because this book came out of writing the Talented Ribkins, and I think it's because I was trying to learn how to write a novel that I just overwrote for that book. So it was part of my research. Like, I know absolutely everything about the backgrounds of all the characters in that book, obviously for generations. Because I wanted to really understand who these people were. So people have asked me that, and they're definitely, you know, at some point I probably will revisit that family, just because there's a lot more I've already written about them. But yeah, I'm actually, I have a collection of short stories coming out next year, which is yeah. Short stories are hard.
And it doesn't have to be that way though. You know, it's like the industry will be like, oh, there's no interest in short stories. And then in turn, they don't like invest the same amount of money in marketing and all that stuff. And so then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'm like, it doesn't have to be that way, but.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Well, see, like your book is doing so great. I feel like there's been a lot of attention for short story collections.
Over the last few years, if you think about, you know, Jamel Brinkley's book, if you think about, you know, Carmen Maria Machado's Her Body and Other Parties, like it's been building for the last few years, and hopefully like that's what I'm hoping that I can contribute to it. And I like what you said about people understanding what you did or what you were trying to do. And I think that's one of the ways I'm measuring success for myself, is not so much like, oh, making a bestsellers list and stuff, because that stuff is extremely hard to do, but like just did it connect with somebody? Did it speak to somebody? And if that happens, oh yay, great, cool.
Right. That's I mean, that's how I felt about it, the first book. That's how I feel about it with this one as well. So I mean, you can't really control anything else.
You can't count on
you can't control that. So that's like, that in and of itself is really gratifying, because you just never never know.
You never know. You will never know. Yeah, we're in the business of uncertainty. Yeah.
Right. So, yeah.
Thank you. Ladee, I love the idea of like, I feel like when people like write a book, they're like, oh, I'm done with that universe. But you're just like, well, I did all this research, you know, it's so rich. I might come back to that at one point. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Well, we've got this very quintessential craft question from the audience. So this is very fun. How much editing or rewrites did you do? I'm assuming for your book. And how did the editing process change the way you read?
I was just gonna go for the rest of this question.
Are you asking
in general?
Yeah, I guess this is like this is a question from the audience, so there was no specific name, so just I think they want your general thoughts on like what is the editing process for these books.
Yeah.
I can say that mostly it is editing. Mostly it's revision and trying, because yeah, it's almost hard to distinguish between the two things for me at this point, because so much of it is trying to um find the character and find the story, and so they're sort of like the same thing almost. That's what takes years really for me, but it's all part of, I mean, I don't know, I think they overlap so much for me, do you know?
Yeah, and I imagine, editing a whole entire novel is very much different than short stories. And the novel that I have that is not finished, I have a whole first draft and I've been trying to revise it. And I'm just like, how do you hold that such a large thing in your head to like revise it? So I think that's what I'm struggling with a little bit. But with the stories, it just depends. Like some of the stories, I'm the type of person who I kind of edit as I go. I know that that's in general like bad, something that tell you not to do, but I think that all advice is like a starting point and then you have to figure out how you work. So what I like to do is, um, I pull up the old draft, I have a blank page. I like to do it on a new document and start retyping it essentially, because it allows me to like do different things and not be
Right.
like beholden to what I had before. And then I just start writing from the top. And even when I'm doing a story, like when I'm creating a whole new story, each time I open the doc, I start at the top and I change sentences and like get the rhythm right, and until I get back to where I was, and that way I'm immersed and then I keep writing. It's just, I do it sentence by sentence, I guess. The rhythm and the sound of the sentences is super important to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see why you took a poetry workshop with us too.
Yeah, I was trying.
Level.
I did learn that I'm not a poet, which is like helpful information to know. But like, but it was really interesting. It was really good to take that class to think about white space and paragraph breaks and things that prose writers don't usually think about that I think are important to how you understand a story.
Thank you. That's great. Another question from the audience. So this, I guess, is for the both of you again. Do you remember how you came up with the idea for your first published story? Think about your first published story chronologically, I guess. Or maybe that's what they mean, because that's literally the question. Do you remember how you came up with the idea for your first published book or story?
Okay, so the first story that was published from this book was an Almanac of Bones, and it was published at Apogee Journal. And I was on Tumblr at some point, and I was just like, like scrolling through Tumblr. You know what Tumblr is? It's like this hodgepodge of a website. There's all kinds of things, images, text, whatever. And I just randomly, I tried to find this and I cannot find it, but there was some person who was basically like, oh yeah, they were telling a story. They were like, oh yeah, I was looking for bones in the forest, and then my mom came and she was like, made me drink a glass of milk, and it was just this thing, and I was just like, what an interesting, like weird, like story, and I wanted to kind of know more, and so I wrote it, because obviously I'm not going to write this person be like, hey, what's up, these are strangers on the internet. But yeah, I kind of get ideas from different places, but a lot of the times it's from like other people in the world.
My first published story would be hard to remember what I did, but I can tell you why I wrote this again, because weirdly, and it's actually in there too. This is why I say I'm always feel good when people can understand something, because I wrote it in response to Trayvon Martin. So, and I remember because I was at UW and I was in Brazil and I saw it on TV in Brazil, and I think it made me really think about the main character is, for all the other things going on, he's very preoccupied with these three boys that are mentioned in that first thing. So his whole thing is to try and protect these three boys. And I really was thinking about the vulnerability of African-American children to racial violence. And I know that that's what made it a very vivid thing for me at the time when I started writing it. But it was very hard to explain, which is why I thought that the protests this summer and how they resulted in, among other things, the removal of all of these icons that have been around for 100 years. And finally, people are saying, oh, these are racist. Let's get rid of them. It was like an odd symmetry for me, because it was often very hard to explain like why you would go from this kind of a current event to talking about like, you know, a sort of minstrel stereotype from 100 years ago. And I think had a kind of really odd symmetry for me. I was like, oh, there is a connection, even if it was really difficult to explain while I was writing it, why I felt moved to talk about these things in this way. So it's like historical fiction, but it was very much grounded in the present, and me thinking about how much really had not changed. Like, a lot has changed, but obviously some really basic fundamental things have not changed at the same time. So
right, because all of this is foundational. I think that's one of the things that I struggle with most, is when people are like, oh, they have this like shock moment of, oh my God, I had no idea this stuff was going on. And it's like, it's because you haven't had to, for whatever reason. But yeah, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. So I can say that.
No, that's great. That's great. I really, yeah, that is such an interesting phenomenon too, especially with white America, or like America as like a, you know, communal mind, right? This idea of like, oh, what? Systemic racism?
Oh my God.
Oh
Shock.
no. What?
Appall. It's like,
right. And yeah, so it's really like a complex thing, and that it's interesting how that became like a springboard for you to write, to, you know, to influence like the novel.
Yeah.
I have another question. And so the Talented Ribkins is largely inspired by Du Bois' famous essay, The Talented Teeth. And so now I'm thinking, because I think everyone else is still like retains their MFA brain. What are the texts? So this is for the both of you. What are the texts that contributed significantly to both the Rib King and Milk Blood Heat, be it stylistically, ideologically, or just like the basis of vibes or energy? Or to phrase it another way, if these books had reading lists that spoke to like larger bodies of work, right? Like if, let's say, Milk Blood Heat had like a playlist, or like the Rib King had like another set of like reference or texts, what other titles would we find there? What other, like who's in the family? What's the genealogy of these books?
I'm deflecting to you, lady, because I have to write it down to know. Like, I'm like writing a list right now, because I'm like, I can't think of brain without writing.
Was someone asked, because there's a lot, I wrote my I have a PhD in folklore and mythology from the University of California, Los Angeles. And I wrote my dissertation on the Chicago World's Fair, but it was about, I was very interested in dance back then, weirdly enough. So it was actually about the performance of identity at the Chicago World's Fair. And I was very interested in movement of people through space, but obviously that intersects a lot of stuff with the movement of commodities at that time, because that was like the beginning of commodity culture, right? When all, you know, because they could you could ship products all over the country at that time. So I have like a list, but it's here, like I have the Black Book, which I read.
Oh, yeah.
I have something, there's a book called The Tramp in America. There's a book called Love and Theft. I have The Black Dancing Body. I actually have this George Black No More by it's a novel from the 1930s. A Beautiful Pageant, Black Looks, Africans and Native Americans, Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, and Rastus, Slave in a Box, Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia, What the Music Said, and some other stuff too. It would be a very broad reading list. It would take me like a little some time to put it together, but I'll let, because it's a historical novel also, so a lot of research went into writing it. I mean, I read so many books, which was, I also have Lucy Parsons, who people don't know about here. Lucy Parsons was an anarchist, a Black woman anarchist around that time. But anyway, yeah, a lot of because it's a historical novel, so my reading list would be very, very long and complicated, just because it becomes a way of me finding my own connections between ideas. So
yeah, so I think while mine would be definitely books, obviously it would also have to include some films, like, because so much of what I'm trying to do is atmospheric and imagistic. And so but to go, I'm thinking about When a Man Falls from the Sky. Is that what it is? It's Leslie Neka Arimo's book, but especially Who Will Greet You at Home. Oh my God, if you haven't read that story, you should read it. It's online. It's in the New Yorker. But How to Breathe Underwater by Julie Oranger. I'm thinking about pretty much everything Antonia Nelson was doing with like female trouble and that kind of like women allowed to be human, and then like me wanting to do that for Black girls and women, especially Floridians and that kind of thing. And then I'm thinking about the Virgin Suicides and like Moonlight and just like these really cinematic, I don't know, just really vivid, gorgeously shot films. Yeah. A lot of stuff. I read so much stuff, and sometimes I'm this type of person. I'm the same way with songs. I'll like, oh, I love this song, but I don't know the title of it. I'm like that with stories too, which is so terrible. I need to start writing them down.
No, that's fair. And I think it's cool too that you brought up Tumblr earlier, right? Like where it's a website of all this, like it's this pastiche like of like fast-paced like images and
Yeah.
text and all these clippings, right? And
Image,
sometimes,
text,
it's difficult to like,
yeah.
like, sometimes you just remember the motif, right? You remember the hook of the song, you remember that one line in the poem, but you don't remember the poem. But that's cool. I love how we have, on Ladee's side, this very annotated scholarly bibliography, and then on Dantiel's we have like,
oh man, yeah, I am not. Sometimes I wish I was a little bit more, but then I'm like,
I mean, there's nothing wrong with either, like,
I'm the me that I am, and that's where the work is coming from. So
there you go. That's true. And I actually, I mean, I if I'm honest, I'm very inspired by film as well. So that would be like a whole other category.
A whole other list.
Corpus.
Yeah.
No, and just in terms of, I really was thinking, I mean, I am very interested in I used to teach in African diaspora performance, blah, blah, blah. It's still academic, right? But I'm very interested in cinematic images and performance and stuff like that. So that actually played a big part of it too. So.
Right. And I think it's a way for our viewers to know that there's so many approaches, right, to like constructing these universes and these texts. We're actually running a little strapped for time. Maybe one last quick question. So like, it's February 2021, we've been in this for almost a year. How has the pandemic like affected your writing practice? Did it just like interrupt your daily life, or like have you developed like new habits or new like ways of looking at things, or not at all, right? Like I remember, Ladee, you mentioned like I'm just trying to make sense of it and then like promote a book at the same time. So like how's the pandemic like maybe like changed or affected, whether that can be negative or positively, like your practice in reading and writing?
Well, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll go first. I'm gonna be really honest that I didn't write much at all for myself during all of last year. It just, it would have been enough, I think, with the revisions for the book and preparing for the promotion for the book and all of that stuff. I think that would have been like a little bit like anxiety making on its own. But when you take into account the pandemic, when you take into account like all the political unrest in this country's like, designs to like murder me and people who look like me, it became very hard to even read most of the time. Like I just kind of had to, at some point during the last year, I had to kind of give myself a little bit of grace, because writing doesn't always look like you actually at the computer writing, right? For me, writing is ingesting films that I'm like thinking about the narratives in those films, or, sometimes being nosy, watching my neighbors and seeing what's going on and trying to understand human impulse and like, what's going on. Or writing is like, just the things that my brain is doing to kind of make connections. Because I think my brain works in the way where it's kind of always churning in narratives and thinking about things and making connections. And so I've been making notes. I've been like thinking about, I think I've been touching the work without touching the work, because I've been making new insights and inroads to like, okay, when I do return to the page, this is the direction I'm going to go in. And now I feel like I'm in a place where I'm finally ready to actually get to the page. And so I think it's okay to go through fallow periods. Not everybody is a write every day kind of writer. But, giving yourself grace when you're in one of those fallow periods, I think is really important to not feel shame, because shame is a really great hindrance in the creative process. So
yeah, well, again, I also have 3 kids, so I've been very affected by just having them all in my not particularly large house. all the time. So, it's something that you kind of have to deal with every day. But aside from everything else, yeah, it's been a very unusual year, and to just accept that. Do you know what I mean? That it's a lot of sort of instability and anxiety, and a lot of suffering too, and
Oh my God.
certainly in yeah, a lot of issues sort of being brought to the surface and requiring, you can't really tune them out. You shouldn't really, but that in terms of me just sitting there writing, it's been very difficult often to do that this past year. So yeah, I've been affected by
You've been
just
affected. Yeah.
I've been
Yeah.
by it. Yeah. So
But that doesn't, it's temporary. Even all things are temporary. So you know what I mean? It's always there. It's always waiting for you, especially if this is something you're called to.
Right. And I think too, like you said, it's sometimes just giving yourself time to process what's going on, and it, opens up new ideas for things too. So you have to go through everything and appreciate it. And like you said, not shame yourself for feeling things. Do you know what I mean? Or
100%.
yeah.
Everybody else, there's a whole world to do that for you. You don't need
Right.
to do it. Exactly.
Right. And I think, we live in a paradigm right now where like so much is like focused on like productivity. It's like, how are you working from
Capitalism.
home? Like, how are you, right? And it's
That's
like,
capitalism's fault.
right. And you're just like, I'm just trying to take a shower once a day and eat, 3 meals.
Yes, I'm trying to.
And that's a lot of work.
Trying to be alive. Yeah, it's a lot.
Right. Well, I think that's a good place to to wrap up, and to folks back home, sometimes 3 meals shower, you've done your
Good.
part.
It's all good.
But on behalf of UW-Madison's Program in Creative Writing and the Wisconsin Book Festival, I'd like to thank Ladee Hubbard and Dantiel Moniz for gracing us with their virtual presence and sharing their masterful work with us. And I'd like to thank all of you back home for making the long drive to your computer or tablet to be here tonight. Please drive back safe. We are still in the thick of winter here in Wisconsin, and the Rib King and Milk Bud Heat will make excellent companions in the coming, let's just hope, days, not weeks, while we are still entombed in ice and snow. But if you'd like to purchase Ladee and Dantiel's books, please support a local bookseller and place your orders through our partnering stores. You can find a full list of them and their contact info on our webpage. That's tinyurl.com/whiskweds. So to the folks at home, we hope that you can join us at our next event featuring an immensely stacked lineup of 4 writers. March 3rd features James Cruz, Chakube Danladi, Rachel Swearingen, and Angela Voris Hills. You can RSVP on Crowdcast and stream the event there on the date itself. You can also access a full list of our events at our webpage and by subscribing to our email list. So once more, thank you so much for logging on, and thank you so much, Ladee and Dantiel, for reading tonight. Thank you so much to Connor Moran for manning tech. I'm Mishka Ligot with the UW-Madison Program in Creative Writing and the Wisconsin Book Festival. Take care, stay home, please wear a mask, please wash your hands, hang in there, and we hope to see you all at the next Wisconsin Wednesday. Good night.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks.